Back now with more Take Two on 89.3 KPCC and kpcc.org. I'm A. Martinez. Pacoima is one of the oldest neighborhoods in the northeast San Fernando Valley, surrounded by 3 freeways and home to an airport, a railway line, and industrial facilities. The predominantly Latino community is one of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in California in terms of pollution. All week, we're going to be delving into the environmental risks Pacoima still faces today and what's being done about it. But first, we start with a history lesson. And here to tell us about how Pacoima came to be is Jean-Paul Contreras de Guzman, a history teacher at Windward School and lecturer at UCLA. His forthcoming book project is called A Touch of Danger, Southern California's San Fernando Valley and the Racial Politics of an American Dream. And also joining us is local historian Crystal Jackson. She's president of the Pacoima Historical Society and author of The Entrance, Pacoima's Story. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Jean-Paul, today residents of Pacoima are predominantly Latino, but that wasn't always the case. Can you walk us through the neighborhood's history when it comes to its demographic makeup and how that's led to the Pacoima we know today?
So, kind of the modern history of Pacoima really begins in the late 1800s when, as you mentioned earlier, the railroads started to come through the East San Fernando Valley. And that is the time period when communities of color, particularly African Americans and Mexican Americans, found employment working on those railroads. And as the San Fernando Valley started to develop through the early 20th century, segregation became more and more hardened, especially after the great water bond issue made so famous in the movie Chinatown that irrigated the San Fernando Valley and turned it into really prime real estate. However, the majority of the valley was off limits to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, except for Pacoima. And so in the mid 20th century, like kind of leading up to World War II, it became this really fascinating, eclectic neighborhood of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Japanese Americans too.
Japanese Americans. How did Japanese Americans get into the mix in Pacoima?
That had to do with the agricultural opportunities located in the East San Fernando Valley. And Japanese American farmers were very lucrative and had their own neighborhood and established a variety of institutions that are actually still in Pacoima to this day.
Now, Jean-Paul, how did World War II change Pacoima in terms of its population as well as industries and also employment opportunities?
Oh, it changed it very dramatically. On the one hand, we would see the rise of brand new industries for wartime defense sprout up in places like Burbank. So if people are familiar with the Burbank Empire Center, that used to be a Lockheed plant. And so African Americans engaged in what historians call the Second Great Migration from the South, finding whole new industrial labor opportunities in places like Lockheed. But again, the only place they could live would be places like Pacoima. Meanwhile, as we know, Japanese Americans were largely liquidated from their homes, their farms, their businesses in Pacoima and the rest of the San Fernando Valley.
So, Crystal, how did the neighborhood change post-World War II? How did the neighborhood in Pacoima change post-World War II?
Post-World War II was actually the nemesis for bringing in the African-American community to Pacoima. After the war, Los Angeles faced a housing shortage, and they ended up developing homes, which they named after a famous heavyweight boxer, Joe Louis. And that was to attract, it was a dog whistle to have the Caucasians not come to buy in that area. And it was a bullhorn for African Americans to come both from the South and from Los Angeles to buy these homes in Pacoima. It was so popular that it populated a good section of Pacoima to eventually having 75% of the African Americans in the general population of Pacoima.
Wow. So, Chris, that's an amazing number, because if someone were to go through Pacoima today, they would not probably think that. Now, today, Pacoima is surrounded by the 5, the 118, and the 210 freeways and is home to a Whiteman Airport, the Valley Generating Station, as well as several landfills, junkyards, and other industrial facilities. Jean-Paul, how and why did the neighborhood become really the site for these freeways and facilities? I remember when my mom and dad moved out of my grandma's house in Koreatown, we moved to Panorama City, which is right next door to Pacoima, and we were wondering why there were so many different kind of industrial facilities all around.
the fact that Pacoima is home to all of these industrial facilities, it abuts all these freeways, that's all by design. Because historically, city planners have basically built those areas deemed undesirable in communities of color. When we go back all the way to the 1930s, an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, deemed the area of Pacoima the lowest grade possible, which was red. And that's why the people of Pacoima have historically been those people who are excluded and been the victims of redlining.
We're talking about the history of Pacoima with Pacoima Historical Society's President Crystal Jackson, as well as Jean Paul Contreras de Guzman, history teacher at Windward School and lecturer at UCLA. Crystal, can you tell us about the history of pollution in Pacoima and also the San Fernando Valley as a whole? I mean, what specific events shed light on some of the environmental risks the community faces today?
There's been a number of environmental risks in Pacoima. I mean, even today with Whiteman Airport, it's creating a huge discord within the community because Whiteman Airport was established there in 1946. Shortly thereafter, in 1955, they built the projects. And people in Pacoima didn't really realize the impact of jet fuel or anything like that. And me, for one, actually lived across the street from the airport there in the projects for a short period of time. And later on, you find out what the effects of that was. But today, they're actually trying to get the airport taken away from Pacoima because of that. So there's a 50-50 split between the community as to whether or not they want that airport to go or stay.